Okay, welcome to our webinar, How San Francisco Was Won, the Good, the Bad, and the Awesome. My name is Jennifer Pei, and I'm the Director of FairVote California.
My name is Pedro Hernandez. I'm the Deputy Director of FairVote California. I probably have been the person in San Francisco running around telling everyone to rank their votes. We had a very successful educational campaign this election cycle. It was a last-minute sprint to educate all the voters because no one anticipated having an election this June, given that our mayor, Ed Lee, passed away in December. So it was quite an effort to engage with the public, but happy to report that we were able to present to more than 5,000 voters and engage many others on social media.
Thanks, Pedro. For those of you that are hearing about FairVote California for the first time, we are a project here statewide working to give voters greater choice and a stronger voice in our elections so that we do have a democracy, a representative democracy that works for all of us. And one of the issues that we champion is ranked choice voting. So what is ranked choice voting? Well, it gives voters the freedom to rank their candidates in order of choice so that everyone's voice is heard. So if your top choice isn't elected, your vote goes to your next choice. And you don't have to worry about throwing your vote away or inadvertently helping the candidate you like the least. It's already being used at all levels of the government throughout the world and in the US. In the next slide, you can see some of the benefits of what ranked choice voting provides for our local elections. That includes promoting fairness, fostering civility, reducing costs, meaning that if you can consolidate and eliminate a primary or a runoff election like San Francisco, supporting greater voter participation, and then finally minimizing strategic voting, vote splitting, and the spoiler effect. So we're going to look through each of these benefits and see how that played out in San Francisco's mayoral election. Well, the first and foremost, what's really exciting to see is that voter turnout really did soar. When you're comparing it to the statewide voter turnout at roughly 36%, San Francisco had 53%, the highest turnout for mayor in 15 years. And what's amazing to see is in comparison to the other counties in the state, we have a total of 58 counties in the state. San Francisco really is at the top of the list. And what we've seen with that greater turnout is greater usage of ranked choice voting. The mayor's race really did drive voter turnout. San Francisco voters cast more ballots for mayor than they did for governor or US senator, meaning the non-ranked choice voting ballots. And people not only came out to this election to vote for their mayor, but in the next slide, you can see that they also ranked. We saw that the higher usage of ranking is not unusual to San Francisco elections. Voters in San Francisco are, since 2004, they've consistently been ranking their ballots, and they've even ranked higher than what we had anticipated. We've seen that 86% of voters used at least 2 of their rankings, and 70% used all 3 of their rankings in the mayor's race. With that being said, in comparison to the governor's race, we saw higher rates of voter error in the governor and the US Senate race than we did for the mayoral race. The city's voters were 6 times more likely to invalidate their ballot for governor than they were for mayor. And when we look at that percentage of how many what we call overvotes, for that mayoral contest, we're really talking about less than 1% of the over 250,000 ballots that were cast. But I know folks may be concerned, well, what does that mean for people that might not have filled out their ballot correctly? Well, what we do know is that the results are more representative of the electorate. In the next slide, you'll see that voters having their ballot count in every round was higher than ever. 9 in 10 voters their ballot count from first to the last round. And that percentage is incredibly high. And the results are reflective of that, where the voters have a real meaningful say in who they want as their next mayor. And in the case of some of these other races in the Bay Area, whether it be for supervisor, city council, or school board. So let's compare some of the concerns that folks may have between what we call exhausted ballots, when the ballot may not count in that final round because they may not have ranked one of the top leading candidates that won, or that they chose not to have a second or third ranking. So in the next slide, you can see that the exhaustion rate in the 2018 mayoral race is significantly lower than if we were to count the folks who did not come back for a second election, whether that is a primary election or in the case of San Francisco, it was a December runoff election for mayor between the years of 2000 and 2003, prior to ranked choice voting. We saw that turnout declined on average by more than 30%. And that number is even higher when we look at the Board of Supervisor races at about 47%. So when we think about the voters and being able to meaningfully participate in the election, it goes back to some of the benefits of ranked choice voting. It does promote fairness because we see that voters are able to cast their ballots based on their hopes rather than on their fears and having to strategically vote. Reducing those costs of having to come back, not just for a second election and paying for that second election administratively, but also in the case of campaigns. And then we've definitely seen supporting greater voter participation. I'll turn it over to Pedro to speak more about how the campaigns played out and speaking to the effects of civility and minimizing strategic voting, vote splitting, and the spoiler effect.
All right. Thanks again, Jen. That was a great synopsis of the facts and data. So in the next slide, thank you. We had 8 candidates that had officially filed in San Francisco this election cycle. Angela Alioto, former supervisor and president of the Board of Supervisors, Michelle Bravo, who was a health worker, London Breed, current president, well, not until last week, but previously at the time of her candidacy was the president of the Board of Supervisors, and for a short period acting mayor. Jane Breed, Jane Kim, who serves as District 6 supervisor, Mark Leno, former senator, Richie Greenberg, Ellen Zhao, and Amy Farrah Weiss. About a month before the elections, a lot of people started paying attention to this election because Mark Leno and Jane Kim expressed their support to mark the other as their number 2 choice. This isn't unusual. This is not unusual in ranked choice voting elections because a ranked choice voting election essentially functions as a runoff. And what you see usually in a traditional runoff is candidates who lost supporting the candidate they would like to prefer to win. Because this happened all at once in a ranked choice voting election, Jane Kim and Mark Leno expressed to their supporters that should one of them be a finalist, that they would prefer their voters and supporters to mark the other one as their number 2 choice. London Breed had her own ranked choice voting strategy, which was essentially to build up her own base of number 1 support and to ask voters across San Francisco to also mark her as her their number 1 choice, their number 2 choice, or their number 3 choice. And that was made apparent in literature that she had as door hangers across the city. Other candidates that use a ranked choice voting strategy included Amy Farrah Weiss, who had a 1, 2, 3 for equity slogan for her campaign, and as well as Angela Alioto, who expressed to her voters to rank her as their 1 or 2 choice vote. But generally, it was probably one of the most exciting San Francisco races that we've had in, at least in the past 15 years. It was the first time that the 2 candidates for the mayor's seat executed a ranked choice voting strategy that proved to many that this is actually something that would a strategy worth pursuing rather than it being just very much based on local district elections. So it was the first time you saw a citywide ranked choice voting strategy in the city of San Francisco. We've seen it in other races, like I said, in supervisor races, and we've seen it across the Bay in other jurisdictions as well. Most notably, probably the 2010 Quan election and other school board elections in Oakland and in the city of Berkeley, where they had elected its first Latino mayor, and he had executed a ranked choice voting strategy as well. So the next slide, I'm going to be showing you the first choice support of the three leading candidates. And this one is for first choice, it's for Mayor-elect London Breed. Mayor-elect London Breed had 3 offices for her campaign, one in the Bayview, one downtown, and one in the West Side. And this is all just first choice support. She led in the plurality count, and a plurality means the most amount of votes that don't necessarily mean a majority of votes. So plurality can mean 35%, which means the most amount of votes, but it may not mean the majority winner. In ranked choice voting, the whole point of electing someone is to elect someone with a 50% plus 1 majority support. London Breed had raised the most amount of money in this election, $1.1 million and counting, or $1.1 million and some change. And what you can see from this map is that the Bayview district, if you're not familiar with San Francisco, you can see here that it's the southern eastern portion of San Francisco, that is the Bayview, Hunters Point area, which is a predominantly, or plurality, about 20% African American population there, went for London Breed, and that was anticipated. And what you see is other pockets go for London Breed with a plurality of support, if not majority support, in some of these precincts, including the Western Addition and some parts of the West Side. The next slide I'll show you is the first choice support for Mark Leno across the city. Here you can see it's right in the middle of San Francisco, and Mark Leno had his office there, and that was strategic for him. The campaign office was placed in District 8 in San Francisco, which also had a supervisor election on its own. So they had it was a special election for the District 8 supervisor there to fill the remaining, or sorry, to fill the remaining term of Senator now-elect Scott Wiener. And District 8 is probably known for its high propensity voters. It has more voters in that district than any other district in San Francisco. It's also home to the Castro District, which is a historical LGBTQ corridor. And Leno himself, a gay man, was also elected as the state's first openly gay state senator. He previously represented this district, and having his office there and having a strong field game in that district was definitely part of his strategy. Generally across the city, he did gain a lot of support, but didn't really break past 60% in a lot of these precincts. In the next slide, I'll show you the first choice support for Jane Kim. Jane Kim had her campaign office in the Mission District, which is probably most known for being a very progressive voter base in San Francisco. But she also had support, and you can see that's the most dark green part of the center of San Francisco. She also had a lot of support in District 5, which is just north center of San Francisco, and some pockets of the West Side. She had the most first choice votes in District 9. Where she edged out London Breed by about 700 votes in that district. Generally, Kim showed to be a strong candidate. She came in third in most of the count, but she led over Mark Leno in 7 of the 11 districts when it came to the plurality count, which is something that I think is often overlooked. So all of these things now, San Francisco voters get up to 3 choices right now, and there were 8 candidates. So in the next slide, we're going to show you a different visualization of the actual count and process of elimination. Ranked choice voting, like we said earlier, voters are allowed to vote their first choice, second choice, and a third choice. And if their first choice is defeated, their number 2 vote gets counted for their second choice, and so on. So here we see that Michelle Bravo was the candidate with the least amount of support in the first count. So she became eliminated, and the number 2 votes for her were transferred to the next candidate. And that continued, and everyone was watching, what would happen when Jane Kim was eliminated and how much of that voter choice would go to Mark Leno and London Breed. When Jane Kim was defeated in this instant runoff, 77% of her voters went to Mark Leno. 77% of voters who had a next choice went to Mark Leno, and the rest went to London Breed. And this kind of showed voters, well, a lot of observers, that ranked choice voting citywide in San Francisco really has the power to keep community vote support together and prove to be a very effective strategy for the Leno campaign. But what's often left out from these conversations is the importance of the trailing votes. The number 2 and number 3 votes of Angela Aliotto, Alan Zhao, Richie Greenberg, Amy Farrah Weiss, and Michelle Bravo. It's that number 2 support and number 3 support for those remaining candidates that actually buffered a lot of London Breed from being overcome by Mark Leno, especially the votes that came from Ellen Zhao and Angela Aliotto. And you'll be able to see a little more of that in the next slide, but let me quickly say is that this was a very close election, so that number 2, number 3 support of those trailing candidates had a huge impact. She, in the end, led by nearly 2,500 votes, and that is just slightly more than a 1 percentage point. Next slide, please. Here's a visualization. Some of you have seen this online. We created this early on, but this is with the updated final numbers. Here you see is what the number 2 and number 3 support for London Breed from the remaining candidates, what that looked like. So here you could see that Michelle Bravo votes that went to Mark Leno and London Breed were pretty flat even. Amy Farrah Weiss, you saw slightly more go for Mark Leno. Richie Greenberg, a few hundred votes, went to London Breed. Ellen Lee Zhao voters, nearly 1,000 votes went to London Breed ahead of Mark Leno. And for Angela Aliotto, that figure was nearly 2,000 votes that went to London Breed over Mark Leno. And then finally, Jane Kim, when Jane Kim was defeated, the ranked choice voting strategy that they executed, the dual endorsement of many other Democratic groups across the city, proved to be very effective. And here you see 7% of the votes that transferred go to Mark Leno over London Breed. And the next slide is a visualization of the final tally and the final results when it came to Mark Leno versus London Breed by precinct. I think this is a more accurate reflection of what the city was looking and thinking when it came to individual precincts and their voter support choice for Mark Leno and London Breed. And here you see pockets of the Castro and pockets of the Mission and Bernal Heights and some pockets of the West Side go Mark Leno, but then you also see London Breed's field really came into play in the northern part of downtown financial district in San Francisco, the Bayview Hunters Point district, and then a lot of the West Side. So a lot of folks haven't seen this map, but this is essentially a more accurate reflection of how the precincts swung in comparison to, just first choice support, second choice, just first choice support of London Breed or first choice support of Mark Leno or Jane Kim. Here's the final round with the votes counted for those remaining 2 candidates. What I'll quickly say is that Mark Leno and Jane Kim across the city, because we're able to collect data from the Department of Elections, they make anonymous ballot image information, and we're able to gather that information to create this visualization. But also you're able to see that Mark Leno and Jane Kim Mark Leno and London Breed were marked as first, second, or third choice candidates across about 60% of voters across San Francisco. So there was a very interesting article in the SF Chronicle that came out today saying that, London Breed has, polls high in the 60s. Well, we weren't necessarily surprised by that because about 60% of voters, indicated London Breed on their ballot somewhere. And the same for Mark Leno is that he was in about 60% of ballots across San Francisco voters. So both would have probably polled very well. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of conversation about the election results and the delay of the reporting. A lot of things happened, but we'll quickly say that ranked choice voting had nothing to do with the delay in the finality of the results. It was essentially the closeness of the race and the amount of ballots that remained to be counted. The day after Election Day, the Department of Elections reported that there were still about 84,000 ballots that needed to be counted. Each ballot had 4 different ballot cards that needed to each be counted. So that was a lot of time and labor. And because essentially at one point it was just a few hundred votes that really made the difference between who was ahead and who wasn't, it was the processing and opening and verifying of those vote by mail ballots. State of California makes it very easy for voters to vote, which is great. Part of that is that there might be slightly delay. Even in the statewide race, there still remains to be about 21,000 votes that need to be counted for statewide elections. And that's even now. We've already certified our election results here in San Francisco. Running the ranked choice voting count, that happened once a day, and it only takes a few minutes to actually do the ranked choice voting count once the ballots are inserted into the machines, essentially. But it took about a week for Mark Leno to concede, because essentially it didn't seem likely like the math of the count was going to go his way. And the more ballots that came in and were counted in that last week essentially just added to London Breed's lead every day. So mathematically, it became very unlikely that Mark Leno was going to be able to overcome the lead that London Breed was gaining as the ballots were counted. But again, the delay in reporting had nothing to do with the ranked choice voting in San Francisco. Next slide, please. So we're very excited for the future of ranked choice voting in San Francisco. Starting in 2019, we're going to be using new voting equipment. And some of the things that are included in that voting equipment is the ability to rank more than 3 candidates, essentially to rank up to 10 candidates. The ballot design right now, we think is a very poor design, and usability experts have essentially helped develop a new ballot design that's already being used in cities across the country. It'll essentially be, instead of 3 columns that repeat the candidates, it'll be 1 column that lists all the candidates and your ability to rank them first, second, or third across the ballot, up to 10 rankings. And it's already being used in Santa Fe just earlier last year, right? It was last year.
In March.
It was early March of this year. Santa Fe used this new voting equipment. They had 5 candidates on their ballot, and some people would be concerned, like, well, does more choices equate to more voter confusion? Well, the answer is no. And the first time that Santa Fe voters engaged with ranked choice voting, with essentially 2 months or 3 months of education, you had up to 60% use all 5 rankings in that election. And we're excited to report that public demonstration of this new ballot design will be beginning this summer. Next slide. I think that concludes a large part of our presentation.
So we'll open it up for Q&A. If you are joining us over the web, you can go ahead and raise your hand. There's a hand icon, and we'll call on you. You can also use the chat box if you wanted to type in something. If you are joining us via phone, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll take questions at this time. And while we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions or comments, if you RSVP'd and we've got your email and you've joined us today, we'll be sending out these slides to you, so feel free to go ahead and share. We're also going to be hosting a couple of trainings later this next month in San Francisco and in Oakland to go into the ins and outs of how ranked choice voting works on the campaign side. So we're excited to share all of this information with you. We just need to RSVP, so we'll get that information up on our website later today. And then feel free to join us on Facebook or Twitter, or sign up on our email list at our website at fairvoteca.org. It looks like we may not have any questions.
We got one question. Is it possible to get a copy of the presentation? I believe that it will be possible to get a copy of the presentation, right, Jen?
Yeah. As I just shared, it's going to be sent over email.
Great. Mm-hmm.
Great.
We have a question from Eric Marr. Eric, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, you guys. Can you respond to Kelvin Welch's piece from a few days ago on 48 Hills? I think his analysis is that there's a folly of progressives to split the vote between two major candidates, and District 8 counts, I think he points to, and I think his conclusion is Jane Kim was a spoiler that if not in the race, Mark Leno could have been the mayor. I'm just wondering if you could respond.
Yeah, okay, so thank you, Eric. We're working on a proper response to Calvin Welch's piece, but I'll quickly add that we actually think that Jane Kim being in the race is what also led to the surge in turnout, that you would have had people who wouldn't ordinarily turn out for a race like this actually turn out because of Jane Kim's candidacy, and that actually increased turnout because voters who necessarily didn't identify with any of the top two candidates actually decided to engage and turn out to vote. And that probably, you know, there's other authors across San Francisco. I think David Campos wrote a piece where he said that, you know, that it was the ranked choice voting strategy that actually helped get a lot of ballot initiatives passed because you had a higher presence. So we actually think that having more candidates in the race helps to increase turnout because you would have candidates reach out to voters who wouldn't ordinarily turn out. So I think that Mr. Welch's assessment of the race has some significant flaws, not only factual flaws when it comes to actual voter preferences, but also misses a huge part of what it meant to have a candidate participate in a race and not be forced out, and that essentially led to greater voter participation.
And Sean, if you can, and thank you to Sean Dugar, who's helping us run this presentation right now. If you can go back to slide number 13, what we can see is, you know, in a traditional two-round election, you would very much see vote splitting and the spoiler effect. Not only that, you would see that, you know, based off of what round 6, you know, the spread between Mark Leno and Jane Kim at roughly, you know, 28, 27%. You know, what does that mean for the supporters of Jane Kim if they weren't able to vote their conscience, right? Not only expressing their support for Jane Kim, but as we saw in her voter base, most of which went to Mark Leno, and then some still did go to London Breed. So with ranked choice voting, that is the benefit. You are able to have your vote meaningfully counted and not fear that your vote might inadvertently help the candidate you like the least, that you have that ranking system available to you as a voter. So that's, you know, what we've seen in the Bay Area, that, you know, according to our reports, more women and people of color are running and winning because you don't have the fear of the vote splitting issue, where people from the same community might be running against each other, but they can still essentially campaign together and encourage their voter bases to rank each other 1, 2, or 3. And then in the future, even more than 3 rankings. So look out for our response to that post. Thanks, Eric, for pointing that out. But we want to make sure folks understand how ranked choice voting works, because once you understand it, then these criticisms that we've seen from some of the traditional media outlets are easily debunked just based on the data and how voters are engaging with ranked choice voting.
Yeah, I would even add that, like, Welch points out to turnout exceptions when turnout has actually gone up in a runoff, and it has happened, but in very few cases. You know, I don't know if, well, it's hard. we've been doing analysis of like the exhausted ballots and what they would do. What would happen to those 8% of ballots if they would have been able to keep ranking? Well, the reality is that a lot of them actually didn't keep ranking. That most of them actually stopped at 1 or 2 candidates, and didn't express a preference for either Mark Lena or Jane Kim, or sorry, Mark Lena or London Breed. And if that's the case, then people came out for Jane Kim as well. It ranked and continued to rank. But if you look at which ballots became exhausted after ranking 1, 2, and 3 and not a finalist, then most of those ballots actually come from candidates that were eliminated, like Angela Alioto, Ellen Zhao, and Richie Greenberg, that tended to favor London Breed as well. So if you want to bootstrap an analysis to see what would happen in a runoff, essentially looking at the involuntary exhausted ballots, those are ballots that had 3 rankings and didn't list a finalist, they would have skewed more likely to London Breed based on the voter preferences of how those voters ranked among people who ranked it for Angela Alioto, Zhao, and Greenberg.
Are there any other questions? And of course, feel free to reach out to either one of us, Pedro at fairvote.org or Jennifer at fairvote.org. We want to thank you for joining us over your lunch break. Keep in touch, and thank you again for, oh, there we go. Thank you again. Here's our contact information and upcoming events and trainings. We look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.